as Hart said, this is the third of a series of three. We're looking at the three characteristics: Anicca, Dukkha, Anatta, change, pain, not self. And let's look at a very brief text to get a sense of where we are. The Buddha says, these things play a part in realization. The perception of impermanence, perception of pain in impermanence, the perception of self in pain. So this is a very brief statement that links these characteristics together. We've talked about impermanence, change, and why for the Buddha change and pain or dukkha are linked. And essentially it's because it's not simply that things change, but things change regardless of whether or not we want them to change, and they change in ways that we cannot control. So seeing the fact of change exposes the inherent unreliability of things and experience. I can't rely on something that's going to change into something else. And when the mind starts to intuit this segues into the perception of dukkha, pain, which at its deepest level is a sense of insecurity and the need to endlessly reconstruct ourselves and our world, going through it again and again and again and again. The burden of change, meaning everything has to be renegotiated. We can't stop and say, okay, that's it. We keep going and we keep going and we keep going and we keep going. So this relentless change, combined with the recognition of the absence of stability, the absence of a solid ground, foundation, and therefore the absence of safety. This is the perception of dukkha, and finally comes the perception of not self. Now, all these are together. They always present as a package. If one of them is there, all three of them are there. But we can't talk about them all at once. Language is linear. And so when the Buddha presents these three characteristics, he presents it as a list, Anicca, Dukkha, Anatta, always in that order. And why does he pick that order? I think it's because he's presenting it from the most gross to the most subtle, the most obvious to the least obvious. So not self is the most subtle and counterintuitive understanding of all three of them. The change is pretty easy to get a hold of, but not necessarily at depth. But once we've got ordinary change as a meditation object, we can go deeper with it. Dukkha is in the deep sense that the Buddha is talking about, is more subtle still, but yep, we can start to pick that one up. But not self is the most obscure, the most difficult to catch, partly because it's not a something. Like change is a something. Okay, there it is, there's change. Pain is a something. Okay, this hurts. But not self is not a something. It's the absence of something. It's the absence of the self. Now, the example that I always give is if you go to a party and all your friends are there, and you look around, and it's very easy to see who's there, but it's much more difficult to see who's not there. It's more difficult to see an absence than to recognize an absence than to recognize a presence. Now, this makes not self particularly subtle and tricky, because the mind has, from the Buddhist perspective, life after life, from our perspective, from the development of any form of consciousness, the mind has constructed this sense that there's someone here to whom all of this is happening. Now, we never actually directly experience this someone, but it's pretty obvious that it's there. I mean, right now I'm sitting in front of a computer screen giving a talk. So it was pretty obvious that this experience, well, first of all, it's located in a very definite place, the physical body. Well, so what's inside this physical body? Well, it's the one to whom all this is happening. It's the self. So we assume the self. It's obvious. It has to be there. Um, and what the Buddha is suggesting is that we assume it, we project it, but we don't actually experience it. And by experience, he has a very clear sense of what he means. Basically, it's not a sense object. Now, here we come to the Buddha's radical empiricism. For the Buddha, what exists, you could say what is real, is that which we experience. And where does experience come from? Well, it comes from the six senses: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, minding. So mind is a sense for the Buddha, just like the others, because all of the senses are sensitivities. They are sensitivities to particular forms of data. So the eyes are sensitive to light, ears are sensitive to sound, mind is sensitive to its particular form of data, perceptions, feelings, images, what we would call thoughts, and so on and so forth. So mind also is a sensitivity. Now for the Buddha, it doesn't make any sense to talk about experiencing something unless that something is the sense object, corresponds to a particular sense sensitivity. Sense object hits the sensitivity accompanied by awareness. The Buddha says the meeting of the three is contact. Um, contact in Pali, phassa, literally it means touch, but contact represents the immediacy of experience. Like right now, something is happening. And for that right now, something to be happening requires minimum these three things. There must be a sense object, there must be a sensitivity, and there's got to be the awareness. They come together, bang, something happens. Now, what the Buddha is saying is self doesn't fit there. The self to fit there, self would have to be a sense object. Otherwise, it couldn't experience it. And the Buddha is a radical empiricist in the sense that he just won't have anything to do with anything we don't experience. Now, historically, if I could do a brief historical detour, the Buddha was raised and educated in a tradition which saw self, in Sanskrit, Atman, as absolutely fundamental. And it saw the practice to be uncovering this Atman and allowing it to manifest in the world and getting into it in deep meditation practice. So the Buddha was educated in this tradition. And then when he left, when he was a teacher in his own right, he completely rejected it. He said, no, an-Atman, not Atman. Now, this is a radical move in the Buddha's time. In India today, it's still a radical move. There are a lot of Indians who feel very patriotic towards the Buddha, after all. Buddha was Indian, one of India's finest sons. Now, there is this problem that he apparently taught not self, an-Atman, but clearly that's a misunderstanding. Actually, he was talking about a deeper Atman. And they try to pull him into the Hindu fold. But he doesn't really belong there. This move of his was very radical. His teaching is very radical. And the basis of it was this empiricism. He said, look, what I'm interested in, and this is where he comes back to dukkha. He said, what I'm interested in is the cessation of dukkha. That's what I'm interested in. Now, after the Buddha, we can talk about Buddha's philosophy, but the Buddha himself was not a philosopher. He was a yogi. He was very intellectual, and he created sophisticated intellectual framework to assist the practice, but he wasn't doing philosophy. He was doing yoga. And the purpose of yoga was the cessation of dukkha. So that's all he's interested in. And dukkha, of course, is an experience. So it's really out there. So what he's interested in is what leads us to the cessation of dukkha. And he came to the conclusion that if we have this self-belief, it doesn't help that project. In fact, it gets in the way. It prevents the cessation of dukkha. And the reason is very interesting because the Buddha looks at this concept of Atma, and he can see it's quite clear you cannot have self without possessions. If you think about where are the borders of myself, of me, well, the obvious answer is, well, it's the physical body, isn't it? Like, go beyond the physical body, that's not me. But what about my possessions? So this watch, for example. Now, this is a pretty old watch. I'm sure it's no longer made, too outdated, but a lot of them were made. It's pretty common. But what makes this watch different from every other watch of the same make and model on the planet? The difference is this watch is mine. Self possesses. How do I know that I am real? Well, in part because my possessions are real, and my possessions define myself. You've probably come across the expression when when the media is blathering on about the latest billionaire, they might say his personal worth is, and they name a sum of money. Have you ever thought how weird that is? Like a person is worth how much money they have. That's pretty weird when you think about it. And yet people routinely talk like this. And it's this association between possession and identity. We are our possessions. Now, when the Buddha talks about self, he says there isn't a something, a self, that we can experience. And therefore, he's not interested. He's only interested in what we can experience. But he says what we do experience is the activity of constructing a self. And this we can experience. So for him, the self is real as a construction project. And it's made up of three aspects. This is mine. I am this. This is myself. So this is mine, possession. Of course, if you, in Buddhist culture, the Buddhist world, you've all heard about attachment and clinging. And you know that these are very bad things indeed, and you should stop right now. Now, both of these English words are translations of the Pali word upadana. If you look at this word, upadana, dana, it's the same dana that Art was talking about. It means gift and it means giving. It's an action verb. So dana, giving. Now when we give, in what direction does what we give travel? It goes out that way towards the receiver. So in this upadana is dana, and then it adds the prefix a, long a, dana. And what this prefix does is it reverses the direction. Long a, means toward. So to give toward, to take. And upa is a prefix which denotes intimacy. So upadana is literally taking, appropriating. And it's the movement of taking something in its broader meaning, which does not belong to us, and taking it as one's own. This is mine. Use a lot can bugger off. This is mine. And we cannot, the Buddha is saying we cannot have a sense, a belief in a self, that I am a self, in his way of looking at it, without appropriating, without mine. If I give up mine, I give up me. And appropriating, taking, for the Buddha, causes pain. So we can't have a self without pain. So this is the first movement. This is mine. Second movement, I am this. Now this one is based on, well, the Buddha calls this mana. And in English, you see it translated as conceit, which is a terrible translation, but we don't really have any equivalent. Literally, it means measuring. You have the root ma, to measure, and then you have na at the end. Again, like dana, it's an action noun. So measuring. Now think about if you measure something. If you take an object and measure its dimensions. If I take this box and I measure it, height, width, depth, I suppose so, whichever one that is. I'm geometrically challenged. But if I measure it, what have I done? I've created a boundary between this and not this and the rest of the world. This is mana. It's the fundamental sense of separation. So this is separate from that, and there's a border between them. Self is produced through this action, this fundamental sense that we all have, that I am in here, yous a lot are out there. And there's a difference. And this difference is really, really, really important. So for example, as a highly practiced and compassionate Buddhist teacher, of course I'm full of compassion for you all. But let's get down to brass tacks, shall we? Look, if something bad happened to you, I'd be quite sad about it. But if something bad happened to me, I'd be devastated. This in here, that out there. And what's important? This in here. And the further out something is, the less important it becomes. You can see this in the mainstream media. Something quite trivial happens in the US or the UK, and it's all over the news. All over the news. Profound, important things happening all the time in Asia. They hardly ever get reported. Why not? Because what's happening in North America and the UK, in the English-speaking world, is closer to us than what's happening in the non-English speaking world. That's further away. It's not a geographic distance. It's a felt significance distance. This is mana. I am this. And then the third movement is this is myself. Now these first two are very subtle, as we're underground. This third one is where the self emerges into consciousness. One place that if any meditator can see it doing its thing is in thinking when we meditate. So for example, most meditators will report that they very easily get distracted by thinking. Have you ever had the experience where you're calmly meditating, developing samadhi on the way to enlightenment, and then suddenly you realize you're thinking? And you notice that what you're thinking about is incredibly routine, tedious, and something you've thought about 2,576 times already, but who's counting? And by the time you wake up and you're in the story, you know already that you're not far from the end because you've been running through this story so many times. And you know exactly how this story is going to end. And the moment you realize that you're distracted, that you're in the middle of this story, you realize I've got a choice. I could keep it going to the end, and I know exactly what that is, and the whole thing is boring beyond belief, or I could drop it and get back to the meditation. I think I'll just finish it off first. And away we go. Why? Why is thinking so sticky? It's because of who do we think about? We think about me. If we think about other people, we think about other people in relation to me. So my friends, my family, my enemies, my country, my planet, etc. It's all about me. And this is what makes it fascinating. So here is where the self pops up, and we can see it in its manifestation much more clearly. The first two movements are relatively underground, and it can take a bit of examination to really tune into them. But this third one is the most surface, and it's the most obvious. This is called view. So self is real for the Buddha as a construction project, but there's actually nothing here in our experience which corresponds to self. And so the practice that we do when we do insight meditation is studying the flow of experience. And what the Buddha doesn't tell us is what we're doing is we're trying to hunt down an experience of self. Basically, the Buddha's challenge. Now, often, if you look at translations of anatta or anatta in Sanskrit, in Pali, anatta, sometimes you see them translated as no self. Sometimes you see them translated more abstractly as non-self. Not quite sure what that's all about. But often you'll hear people say the Buddha teaches no self. He teaches there is no self. Now, this is common, for example, in Orthodox Theravada. When I was in Burma, that's the way the sayadaws would talk. There is no person, no being, no this, no that, blah, 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 blah. They gave the whole series of synonyms. And they're quite clear. There is not, there's no person, etc. But I don't think that was what the Buddha was saying. In fact, sometimes he had the opportunity to deny the existence of the self, and he didn't take that opportunity. He preferred to stay silent. He wasn't saying that there is not a self, that there isn't one. He's saying we can't find one. He's saying this experience right now is not self. This experience over here is not self. This seeing, this hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, minding, each one of them is not self. When he's talking about self, he says the language is always very specific. This is mine. I am this. This is myself. That's the construction of the self. In other words, we seize upon an experience, this, and we construct a self out of it. But what he's saying is, when we see accurately, we can see this. When we're constructing a self, this is mine. When we actually see it accurately, we see this is not mine. I am not this. This is not myself. So you see the difference. He's not saying there is no self. He's saying this is not self. 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 Completely specific. He's not making a big statement about the world. He's saying, look at this experience. Is it self? Well, to qualify as self in ancient India has to be unchanging over time. Well, even to qualify for self in our world, it has to be unchanging over time. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean eternal, as I think we might have talked about when we're talking about impermanence, but simply remaining the same over time. For example, someone came here to attend this Zoom meeting. Do you feel deep in your bones that the person who will end this Zoom meeting is the same person as the person who began it? This is the view of self. But the Buddha is saying, if you're actually tracking experience carefully, you realize that the one who began this meeting is different from the one who ends it. They're not the same. Experiences change. Um, so not self is a teaching about the nature of experience. It's not a big cosmological claim. The Buddha is saying, look, do you think that there's something in your experience which qualifies as self? Well, it's got to be unchanging over time. What does it mean to be Patrick? Unless for all the years of my life, this person has always been the same. That there's something that hasn't changed. There has to be, because what's the point? How can I say I in the same one who was born in Sydney all those decades ago? Can't do it. So he says, if something qualifies as self, it's got to be unchanging over time. And it's got to be satisfactory. Even, well, often it's translated as blissful, but it could be just satisfactory. No problem with it. Can you think of an experience in which you have no problem with it? Let's say it's a very pleasant experience. Let's say it's a wonderful experience. Is it a problem that it ends? Could be. So, and of course, we can't find, so it segues into, we can't find anything that we can pin the label. This is myself, this experience, this is it. So the Buddha is not saying there isn't one. He's saying, try looking for it. And by the way, good luck with that. And in the terms of the practice, it's the recognition that the mind's recognition, the heart's recognition at a very deep level that, oh my God, I can't find it, which represents the understanding of not self. And this happens very deep, at a deeper than conscious level, but it kind of percolates up and things start to change. In the early stages, this understanding can be deeply shocking, profoundly disorienting, because I've always assumed I'm here. But if I'm not here, who is here? Freak out. So dukkha. But if we get past this, and if we get kind of the mind settles into this understanding, then it segues into a steady perception of not self, which is characterized in the heart by equanimity and mindfulness. But let's focus on equanimity, balance. Remember that for the Buddha, self depends on possession. This is mine. Possession is inherently discombobulating. I've got something, but now I've got to keep it. I've got to defend it. I have to insure it. I've got to make enough money to pay the insurance. What happens when it breaks? It's very disappointing. I've got to trade it in. It didn't last long enough. There's an inherent dissatisfaction involved in this relationship, mine. When the perception of not self matures, there's a recognition that I don't depend on mine. It's not fundamental to my existence. So the heart is much more balanced, less unstable, less easily upset. So there's a depth of stability in the mind and the heart when this perception becomes clear. And this is what is called, in English, equanimity. In Pali, this is upekkha, which in Sanskrit, it's upeksha. And you get with Sanskrit words, you get a bit better sense of the roots involved. It comes from the root ich, to see, and again, the prefix upa, which we had a look at before, intimacy. Upekkha in Pali is intimate witnessing. So we see what's happening now. We see the flow of experience and we see it intimately. Now, this idea of seeing is interesting. If I see something, there has to be distance between me and what I see. So I can see this screen clearly because I'm the appropriate distance away, aided by the appropriate specs. If I was getting too close, I wouldn't be able to see it. It's too close. If I was too far away, I couldn't see it, too blurry. And seeing implies a separation gap, unlike, for example, feeling, which implies really getting into something. So seeing implies a difference, a separation, a distance. But this is seeing intimately, seeing from very, very close up. It's intimate witnessing. And what I think the Buddha is getting at is it's not hopelessly entangled. There's a balance. There's a detachment. But it's not a pushing away. It's not a turning away from. It's intimate. And what are the characteristics of this intimacy and balance? Is that experience flows much more readily. Now, if I'm constantly grabbing at experience, this is mine. Alternatively, I don't want that. There's not much balance. But if the heart and the mind is characterized by an intimate witnessing of not just letting the experience flow on and letting nature do what nature does, it's a whole different way of life. And for the Buddha, it's in that experience that we can experience the cessation of dukkha in the different ways in which he talks about it. But as I said, it's very subtle because it's not a something. It's the recognition of an absence. And that recognition is very deep and it cannot be artificially generated. It arises when chitta, when the heart and mind is ripe. And that's it. You can't force it. I think it was, anyway, I think we've gone half an hour. And yes, that's one last thing I wanted to say. And not self is not something that we can intellectually understand. I mean, we can understand the theories around it, but not self is something that we either get or we don't get. This is why when I give talks on not self, I like to say, I like to give my guarantee. If you don't understand not self at the beginning of this talk, I can guarantee you won't understand it at the end. Because you can't get it intellectually. I call it Buddha's joke. If you telling someone some elaborate joke which involves going through this whole story, then you've got their attention, and then you hit them with the punchline. And if they stare at you blankly and they say, "Could you explain that?" Is there any point in explaining it? It's a joke. You either get it or you don't get it. If they don't get it, you may as well just give up and walk away. Not self. The perception of not self is like Buddha's joke. You either get it or you don't get it. But the way to getting it is through the mindfulness practice. This is the practice that the Buddha designed to strip away the misconceptions and the graspings that obscure what for him is the fact of not self. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. That was so nicely segued into the practice that we'll be doing in a couple of minutes. So thank you for making that connection.
If you want to put a not-self flavor into the practice, whenever you come across something that stirs you up in some way, could be just slightly like a disturbing thought, just drop in the question, does this belong to me? Is this me? Just drop the question in and see what happens.
Thank you, Patrick. We'll be doing that.